motionless in space, thousands of miles distant from the warring fleets of spaceships so viciously attacking and so stubbornly defending Roger's planetoid. In the captain's sanctum, Lyman Cleveland crouched tensely above his ultra-cameras. His sensitive fingers touched lightly their micrometric dials. His body was rigid, his face was set and drawn. Only his eyes moved, flashing back and forth between his instruments and the smoothly running strands of steel spring wire upon which were being recorded the frightful scenes of carnage and destruction. Silent and bitterly absorbed, though surrounded by staring officers whose fervent, almost unconscious cursing was prayerful in its intensity, the Visiray expert kept his ultra-instruments upon that awful struggle to its dire conclusion. Flawlessly those instruments noted every detail of the destruction of Roger's fleet, of the transformation of the armada of Triplanetary into an unknown fluid, and finally of the dissolution of the gigantic planetoid itself. Then furiously Cleveland drove his beam against the crimsonly opaque obscurity into which the peculiar viscous stream of substance was disappearing. Time after time he applied his every watt of power with no result. A vast volume of space, roughly ellipsoidal in shape, was closed to him by forces entirely beyond his experience or comprehension. But suddenly, while his rays were still trying to pierce that impenetrable murk, it disappeared instantly and without warning. The illimitable infinity of space once more lay revealed upon his plates, and his beams flashed unimpeded through the void. "Back to Tellus, sir?" The Chicago's captain broke the strained silence. "I wouldn't say so if I had the say." Cleveland, baffled and frustrated, straightened up and shut off his cameras. "We should report back as soon as possible, of course, but there seems to be a lot of wreckage out there yet that we can't photograph in detail at this distance. A close study of it might help us a lot in understanding what they did and how they did it. I'd say that we should get close-ups of whatever is left, and do it right away, before it gets scattered all over space. But, of course, I can't give you orders." "You can, though," the captain made surprising answer. "My orders are that you are in command of this vessel." "In that case, we will proceed at full emergency acceleration to investigate the wreckage," Cleveland replied, and the cruiser, sole survivor of Triplanetary's supposedly invincible force, shot away with every projector delivering its maximum blast. As the scene of the disaster was approached, there was revealed upon the plates a confused mass of debris, a mass whose individual units were apparently moving at random, yet which was, as a whole, still following the orbit of Roger's planetoid. Space was full of machine parts, structural members, furniture, flotsam of all kinds, and everywhere were the bodies of men. Some were encased in spacesuits, and it was to these that the rescuers turned first. Space-hardened veterans though the men of the Chicago were, they did not care even to look at the others. Strangely enough, however, not one of the floating figures spoke or moved, and space-line men were hurriedly sent to investigate. "All dead." Quickly the dread report came back. "Been dead a long time. The armor is all stripped off the suits, and all the generators and other apparatus are all shot. Something funny about it, too. None of them seem to have been touched, but the machinery of the suits seems to be about half missing." "I've got it all on the reel, sir." Cleveland, his close-up survey of the wreckage finished, turned to the captain. "What they've just reported checks up with what I have photographed everywhere. I've got an idea of what might have happened, but it's so new that I'll have to have some evidence before I'll believe it myself. You might have them bring in a few of the armored bodies, a couple of those switchboards and panels floating around out there, and half a dozen miscellaneous pieces of junk. The nearest things they can get hold of, whatever they happen to be." "Then back to Tellus at maximum?" "Right, back to Tellus as fast as we can possibly get there." While the Chicago hurtled through space at full power, Cleveland and the ranking officers of the vessel grouped themselves about the salvaged wreckage. Familiar with space wrecks as were they all, none of them had ever seen anything like the material before them. For every part and instrument was weirdly and meaninglessly disintegrated. There were no breaks, no marks of violence, and yet nothing was intact. Bolt holes stared empty, cores, shielding cases, and needles had disappeared. The vital parts of every instrument hung awry. Disorganization reigned rampant and supreme. "I never imagined such a mess," the captain said, after a long and silent study of the objects. "If you have a theory to cover that, Cleveland, I would like to hear it." "I want you to notice something first," the expert replied. "But don't look for what's there. Look for what isn't there." "Well, the armor is gone. So are the shielding cases, shafts, spindles. the housing and stems. The captain's voice died away as his eyes raced over the collection. Why, everything that was made of wood, bakelite, copper, aluminum, silver, bronze, or anything but steel hasn't been touched, and every bit of that is gone. But that doesn't make sense. What does it mean? I don't know, yet, Cleveland replied slowly. But I'm afraid that there's more and worse. He opened a spacesuit reverently, revealing the face, a face calm and peaceful, but utterly, sickeningly white. Still reverently, he made a deep incision in the brawny neck, severing the jugular vein, then went on soberly. You never imagined such a thing as white blood, either, but it all checks up. Some way, somehow, every atom of free or combined iron in this whole volume of space was made off with. Huh? How come? And above all, why? From the amazed and staring officers. You know as much as I do, grimly, ponderingly. If it were not for the fact that there are solid asteroids of iron out beyond Mars, I would say that somebody wanted iron badly enough to wipe out the fleet and the planetoid to get it. But anyway, whoever they were, they carried enough power so that our armament didn't bother them at all. They simply took the metal they wanted and went away with it. So fast that I couldn't trace them with an ultrabeam. There's only one thing plain, but that's so plain that it scares me stiff. This whole affair spells intelligence with a capital I, and that intelligence is anything but friendly. I want to put Fred Rodebush at work on this just as fast as I can get him. He stepped over to his ultra-projector and put in a call for Virgil Samms, whose face soon appeared upon his screen. "We got it all, Virgil," he reported. "It's something extraordinary, bigger, wider, and deeper than any of us dreamed. It may be urgent, too, so I think I had better shoot the stuff in on an ultrabeam and save some time. Fred has a telemagneto recorder that he can synchronize with this outfit easily enough, right?" "Right. Good work, Lyman. Thanks," came back terse approval and appreciation, and soon the steel wires were again flashing from reel to reel. This time, however, their varying magnetic charges were so modulating ultrawaves that every detail of that calamitous battle of the void was being screened and recorded in the innermost private laboratory of the Triplanetary Service. Eager though he naturally was to join his fellow scientists, Cleveland was not impatient during the long but uneventful journey back to Earth. There was much to study, many improvements to be made to his comparatively crude first ultra camera. Then, too, there were long conferences with Samms, and particularly with Rodebush, the nuclear physicist, who would have to do much of the work involved in solving the riddles of the energies and weapons of the Nevians. Thus, it did not seem long before green Terra grew large beneath the flying sphere of the Chicago. "Going to have to circle at once, aren't you?" Cleveland asked the chief pilot. He had been watching that officer closely for minutes, admiring the delicacy and precision with which the great vessel was being maneuvered preliminary to entering the Earth's atmosphere. "Yes," the pilot replied. "We had to come in the shortest possible time, and that meant a velocity here that we can't check without a spiral. However, even at that, we saved a lot of time. You can save quite a bit more, though, by having a rocket plane come out to meet us somewhere around 15 or 20,000 kilometers, depending upon where you want to land. With their drives, they can match our velocity and still make the drop direct." "Guess I'll do that, thanks." And the operative called his chief, only to learn that his suggestion had already been acted upon. "We beat you to it, Lyman," Samms smiled. "The Silver Sliver is out there now, looping to match your course, acceleration, and velocity at 22,000 kilometers. You'll be ready to transfer?" "I'll be ready," and the quartermaster's ex-clerk went to his quarters and packed his dunnage bag. In due time, the long, slender body of the rocket plane came into view, creeping down upon the spaceship from above, and Cleveland bade his friends goodbye. Donning a spacesuit, he stationed himself in the starboard airlock. Its atmosphere was withdrawn, the outer door opened, and he glanced across a bare 100 feet of space at the rocket plane which, keel ports fiercely aflame, was breaking her terrific speed to match the slower pace of the gigantic sphere of war. Shaped like a toothpick, needle-pointed fore and aft, with ultra-stubby wings and vanes, with flush-set rocket ports everywhere, built of a lustrous silvery alloy of noble and almost infusible metals, such was the private speedboat of Triplanetary's head man. The fastest thing known, whether in planetary air, the stratosphere, or the vacuous depth of interplanetary space, Her first flashing trial spins had won her the nickname of the Silver Sliver. She had had a more formal name, but that title had long since been buried in departmental files. Lower and lower dropped the speedboat, her rockets flaming ever brighter, until her slender length lay level with the airlock door. Then her blasting discharges subsided to the power necessary to match exactly the Chicago's acceleration. "Ready to cut, Chicago. Give me a 3-second call," snapped the pilot room of the Sliver. "Ready to cut," the pilot of the Chicago replied. "Seconds, 3, 2, 1, cut." At the last word, the power of both vessels was instantly cut off, and everything in them became weightless. In the tiny airlock of the slender plane crouched a space-line man with coiled cable in readiness, but he was not needed. As the flaring exhaust ceased, Cleveland swung out his heavy bag and stepped lightly off into space, and in a right line he floated directly into the open port of the rocket plane. The door clanged shut behind him, and in a matter of moments he stood in the control room of the racer, divested of his armor and shaking hands with his friend and co-laborer, Frederick Rodebush. "Well, Fritz, what do you know?" Cleveland asked, as soon as greetings had been exchanged. "How do the various reports dovetail together? I know that you couldn't tell me anything on the wave, but there's no danger of eavesdroppers here." "You can't tell," Rodebush soberly replied. "We're just beginning to wake up to the fact that there are a lot of things we don't know anything about." "Better wait until we're back at the Hill. We have a full set of ultra screens around there now. There's a couple of other good reasons, too. It would be better for both of us to go over the whole thing with Virgil from the ground up, and we can't do any more talking anyway. Our orders are to get back there at maximum, and you know what that means aboard the Sliver. Strap yourself solid in that shock absorber there, and here's a pair of earplugs." "When the Sliver really cuts loose, it means a rough party, all right," Cleveland assented, snapping about his body the heavy spring straps of his deeply cushioned seat. "But I'm just as anxious to get back to the Hill as anybody can be to get me there. All set." Rodebush waved his hand at the pilot, and the purring whisper of the exhausts changed instantly to a deafening, continuous explosion. The men were pressed deeply into their shock-absorbing chairs as the Silver Sliver spun around her longitudinal axis and darted away from the Chicago with such a tremendous acceleration that the spherical warship seemed to be standing still in space. In due time, the calculated midpoint was reached, the slim space plane rolled over again, and, mad acceleration now reversed, rushed on toward the Earth, but with constantly diminishing speed. Finally, a measurable atmospheric pressure was encountered, the needle prow dipped downward, and the Silver Sliver shot forward upon her tiny wings and vanes, nose rockets now drumming in staccato thunder. Her metal grew hot, dull red, bright red, yellow, blinding white, but it neither melted nor burned. The pilot's calculations had been sound, and though the limiting point of safety of temperature was reached and steadily held, it was not exceeded. As the density of the air increased, so decreased the velocity of the man-made meteorite. So it was that a dazzling lance of fire sped high over Seattle, lower over Spokane, and hurled itself eastward, a furiously flaming arrow, slanting downward in a long, screaming drive toward the heart of the Rockies. As the now rapidly cooling greyhound of the skies passed over the western ridges of the Bitterroots, it became apparent that her goal was a vast, flat-topped conical mountain shrouded in violet light, a mountain whose height awed even its stupendous neighbors. While not artificial, the hill had been altered markedly by the engineers who had built into it the headquarters of the Triplanetary Service. Its mile-wide top was a jointless expanse of gray armor steel. The steep, smooth surface of the truncated cone was a continuation of the same immensely thick sheet of metal. No known vehicle could climb that smooth, hard, forbidding slope of steel. No known projectile could mar that armor. No known craft could even approach the hill without detection. Could not approach it at all, in fact, for it was constantly enclosed in a vast hemisphere of lambent violet flame through which neither material substance nor destructive ray could pass. As the Silver Sliver, crawling along at a bare 500 miles an hour, approached that transparent, brilliantly violet wall of destruction, a light of the same color filled her control room and as suddenly went out, flashing on and off again and again. "Giving us the once-over, eh?" Cleveland asked. "That's something new, isn't it?" "Yes, it's a high-powered ultra-wave spy," Rodebush returned. "The light is simply a warning which can be carried if desired. It can also carry voice and vision." "Like this." Sam's voice interrupted from a speaker upon the pilot's panel, and his clear-cut face appeared upon the television screen. "I don't suppose Fred thought to mention it, but this is one of his inventions of the last few days. We are just trying it out on you. It doesn't mean a thing, though, as far as the sliver is concerned. Come ahead." A circular opening appeared on the wall of force, an opening which disappeared as soon as the plane had darted through it, and at the same time her landing cradle rose into the air through a great trap-door. Slowly and gracefully the space plane settled downward into that cushioned embrace. Then cradle and nestled sliver sank from view, and turning smoothly upon mighty trunnions, the plug of armor drove solidly back into its place in the metal pavement of the mountain's lofty summit. The cradle elevator dropped rapidly, coming to rest many levels down in the heart of the hill, and Cleveland and Rodebush leaped lightly out of their transport through her still hot outer walls. A door opened before them, and they found themselves in a large room of unshadowed daylight illumination, the office of the Chief of the Triplanetary Service. Calmly efficient executives sat at their desks, concentrating upon problems or at ease, according to the demands of the moment. Agents, secretaries, and clerks, men and women, went about their wonted tasks. Televisotypes and recorders flashed busily but silently, each person and machine an integral part of the service which for so many years had been carrying an ever-increasing share of the load of governing the 3 planets. "Right of way, Norma?" Rodebush paused before the desk of Virgil Sam's private secretary. She pressed a button, and the door behind her swung wide. "You two do not need to be announced." The attractive young woman smiled. "Go right in." Samms met them at the door eagerly, shaking hands particularly vigorously with Cleveland. "Congratulations on that camera, Lyman," he exclaimed. "You did a wonderful piece of work on that. Help yourselves to smokes and sit down. There are a lot of things we want to talk over. Your pictures carried most of the story, but they would have left us pretty much at sea without Costigan's reports. But as it was, Fred here and his crew worked out most of the answers from the dope the two of you got. And what few they haven't got yet, they soon will have. Nothing new on Conway?" Cleveland was almost afraid to ask the question. "No." A shadow came over Sam's face. "I'm afraid, but I'm hoping it's only that those creatures, whatever they are, have taken him so far away he can't reach us." "They certainly are so far away that we can't reach them," Rodebush volunteered. "We can't even get their ultra-wave interference anymore." "Yes, that's a hopeful sign," Samms went on. "I hate to think of Conway Costigan checking out. There, fellows, was a real observer. He was the only man I have ever known who combined the two qualities of the perfect witness. He could actually see everything he looked at, and could report it truly, to the least detail. Take all this stuff, for instance, especially their ability to transform iron into a fluid allotrope, and in that form to use its atomic, nuclear, energy as power. Something brand new, and yet he described their converters and projectors so minutely that Fred was able to work out the underlying theory in 3 days, and to tie it in with our own super ship. My first thought was that we'd have to rebuild it, iron-free, but Fred showed me my error. You found it yourself, of course. It wouldn't do any good to make the ship non-ferrous unless you could so change our blood chemistry that we could get along without hemoglobin, and that would be quite a feat, Cleveland agreed. Then, too, our most vital electrical machinery is built around iron cores. We'd also have to develop a screen for those screens, so powerful that they can't drive anything through them. "We've been working along those lines ever since you reported," Rodebush said, "and we're beginning to see light. And in that same connection, it's no wonder that we couldn't handle our supership. We had some good ideas, but they were wrongly applied. However, things look quite promising now. We have transformation of iron all worked out in theory, and as soon as we get a generator going, we can straighten out everything else in short order. And think what that unlimited power means. All the power we want. Power enough even to try out such hitherto purely theoretical possibilities as the neutralization of the inertia of matter." "Hold on," protested Samms. "You certainly can't do that. Inertia must be a basic attribute of matter, and surely cannot be done away with without destroying the matter itself. Don't start anything like that, Fred. I don't want to lose you and Lyman, too." "Don't worry about us, Chief," Rodebush replied with a smile. "If you will tell me what matter is, fundamentally, I may agree with you. No? Well, then, don't be surprised at anything that happens. We're going to do a lot of things that nobody on the 3 planets ever thought of doing before." Thus, for a long time, the argument and discussion went on, to be interrupted by the voice of the secretary. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Sams, but some things have come up that you will have to handle. Nobos is calling from Mars. He has caught the Endymion and has killed about half her crew doing it. Milton has finally reported from Venus after being out of touch for 5 days. He trailed the Wintons into Thalaron Swamp. They crashed him there, and he won out and has what he went after. And just now, I got a flash from Fletcher in the asteroid belt. I think that he has finally traced that dope line, but Nobos is on now. What do you want him to do about the Endymion?" "Tell him to... No, put him on here. I'd better tell him myself," Samms directed, and his face hardened in ruthless decision as the horny, misshapen face of the Martian lieutenant appeared upon the screen. "What do you think, Nobos? Shall they come to trial or not?" "Not. I don't think so either. It is better that a few gangsters should disappear in space than that the patrol should have to put down another uprising. See to it." "Right." The screen darkened, and Samms spoke to his secretary. "Put Milton and Fletcher on whenever they come in." He turned to his guests. "We've covered the ground quite thoroughly. Goodbye. I wish I could go with you, but I'll be pretty well tied up for the next week or two." "Tied up doesn't half express it," Rodebush remarked as the 2 scientists walked along a corridor toward an elevator. "He probably is the busiest man on 3 planets." "As well as the most powerful," Cleveland supplemented. "And very few men could use his power as fairly, but he's welcome to it as far as I'm concerned. I'd have the pink fantods for a month if I had to do only once what he's just done. And to him it's just part of a day's work." "You mean the Endymion? What else could he do?" "Nothing. That's the hell of it. It had to be done, since bringing them to trial would mean killing half the people of Marseca. But at the same time, it's a ghastly thing to order a job of deliberate, cold-blooded, and illegal murder. You're right, of course, but you would—" He broke off, unable to put his thoughts into words. For while inarticulate, manlike, concerning their deepest emotions, in both men were ingrained the code of the organization. Both knew that to every man chosen for it, the service was everything, himself nothing. "But enough of that. We'll have plenty of grief of our own right here." Rodebush changed the subject abruptly as they stepped into a vast room, almost filled by the immense bulk of the Boise, the sinister spaceship which, although never flown, had already lined with black so many pages of Triplanetary's roster. She was now, however, the center of a furious activity. Men swarmed over her and through her in the orderly confusion of a fiercely driven but carefully planned program of reconstruction. "I hope your dope is right, Fritz," Cleveland called as the 2 scientists separated to go to their respective laboratories. "If it is, we'll make a perfect lady out of this unmanageable man-killer yet." End of Chapter 13. Triplanetary, first in the Lensman series by E. Doc Smith. Chapter 14. The Supership is Launched. After weeks of ceaseless work, during which was lavished upon her every resource of mind and material afforded by 3 planets, the Boise was ready for her maiden flight. As nearly ready, that is, as the thought and labor of man could make her. Rodebush and Cleveland had finished their last rigid inspection of the aircraft, and standing beside the center door of the main airlock, were talking with their chief. "You say that you think it's safe, and yet you won't take a crew," Samms argued. "In that case, it isn't safe enough for you 2 either. We need you too badly to permit you to take such chances." "You've got to let us go, because we are the only ones who are at all familiar with her theory," Rodebush insisted. "I said, and I still say, that I think it is safe. I can't prove it, however, even mathematically, because she's altogether too full of too many new and untried mechanisms, too many extrapolations beyond all existing or possible data. Theoretically, she is sound, but you know that theory can only go so far, and that mathematically negligible factors may become operative at those velocities. We do not need a crew for a short trip. We can take care of any minor mishaps, and if our fundamental theories are wrong, all the crews between here and Jupiter wouldn't do any good. Therefore, we 2 are going alone." "Well, be very careful anyway. I wish that you could start out slow and take it easy. In a way, so do I. But she wasn't designed to neutralize half of gravity, nor half of the inertia of matter. It's got to be everything or nothing as soon as the neutralizers go on. We could start out on the projectors, of course, instead of on the neutralizers, but that wouldn't prove anything, and would only prolong the agony." "Well, then be as careful as you can." "We'll do that, Chief," Cleveland put in. "We think as much of us as anybody else does, maybe more, and we aren't committing suicide if we can help it. And remember about everybody staying inside when we take off. It's barely possible that we'll take up a lot of room. Goodbye." "Goodbye, fellows." The massive insulating doors were shut, the metal side of the mountain opened, and huge squat caterpillar tractors came roaring and clanking into the room. Chains and cables were made fast, and, mighty steel rails groaning under the load, the spaceship upon her rolling ways was dragged out of the hill and far out upon the level floor of the valley, before the tractors cast off and returned to the fortress. "Everybody is under cover," Samms informed Rodebush. The Chief was staring intently into his plate, upon which was revealed the control room of the untried supership. He heard Rodebush speak to Cleveland, heard the observer's brief reply, saw the navigator push the switch button, then the communicator plate went blank. Not the ordinary blankness of a cutoff, but a peculiarly disquieting fading out into darkness. And where the great spaceship had rested, there was, for an instant, nothing. Exactly nothing. A vacuum. Vessel, falsework, rollers, trucks, the enormous steel I-beams of the tracks, even the deep-set concrete piers and foundations, and a vast hemisphere of the solid ground, all disappeared utterly and instantaneously. But almost as suddenly as it had been formed, the vacuum was filled by a cyclonic rush of air. There was a detonation as of 100 vicious thunderclaps made one, and through the howling, shrieking blasts of wind there rained down upon valley, plain, and metalled mountain a veritable avalanche of debris, bent, twisted, and broken rails and beams, splintered timbers, masses of concrete, and thousands of cubic yards of soil and rock. For the atomic-powered Rodebush-Cleveland neutralizers were more powerful by far, and had a vastly greater radius of action than the calculations of their designers had shown. And for a moment everything within 100 yards or so of the Boise behaved as though it were an integral part of the vessel. Then, left behind immediately by the supership's almost infinite velocity, all this material had again become subject to all of nature's everyday laws and had crashed back to the ground. "Could you hold your beam, Randolph?" Samms' voice cut sharply through the daze of stupefaction which held spellbound most of the denizens of the hill. But all were not so held. No conceivable emergency could take the attention of the chief ultrawave operator from his instruments. "No, sir," Radio Center shot back. "It faded out, and I couldn't recover it. I put everything I've got behind a tracer on that beam, but haven't been able to lift a single needle off the pin." "And no wreckage of the vessel itself," Samms went on half audibly. "Either they have succeeded far beyond their wildest hopes, or else, more probably—" He fell silent and switched off the plate. Were his two friends, those intrepid scientists, alive and triumphant, or had they gone to lengthen the list of victims of that man-killing spaceship? Reason told him that they were gone. They must be gone, or else the ultrabeams, energies of such unthinkable velocity of propagation that man's most sensitive instruments had never been able even to estimate it, would have held the ship's transmitter in spite of any velocity attainable by matter, under any conceivable conditions. The ship must have been disintegrated as soon as Rodebush released his forces. And yet, had not the physicist dimly foreseen the possibility of such an actual velocity? Or had he? However, individuals could come and go, but the service went on. Samms squared his shoulders unconsciously, and slowly, grimly, made his way back to his private office. "Mr. Fairchild would like to have a moment as soon as possible, sir," his secretary informed him even before he sat down. "Senator Morgan has been here all day, you know, and he insists on seeing you personally." "Oh, that kind, eh? All right, I'll see him. Get Fairchild, please. Dick, can you talk, or is he there listening?" "No, he's heckling Saunders at the moment. He's been here long enough. Can you take a minute and throw him out?" "Of course, but why not throw the hooks into him yourself, as usual? He wants to lay down the law to you personally. He's a big shot, you know, and his group is kicking up quite a row, so it might be better to have it come straight from the top. Besides, you've got a unique knack. When you throw a harpoon, the harpoonee doesn't forget it." "All right. He's the uplifter and leveler down. Down with Triplanetary, up with national sovereignty. We're power-mad dictators, iron heel on the necks of the people, and so on. But what's he like personally? Thick-skinned, of course. Got a brain?" "Rhinoceros. He's got a brain, but it's definitely weaseloid. Bear down, sink it in full length, and then twist it. Okay, you've got a harpoon, of course? 3 of 'em. Fairchild, head of Triplanetary's public relations, grinned with relish. Boss Gemtown owns him in fee simple. The number of his hot lock box is N469T414. His subist sub-Rosa girlfriend is Phi Chi LeBay. Yes, everything that the name implies. She got a super deluxe fur coat. Martian Teckle, no less, out of that Mackenzie River power deal. Triple play, you might say. Clander to Morgan to LeBay. Nice. Bring him in. Senator Morgan, Mr. Sams. Fairchild made the introduction, and the two men sized each other up in lightning glances. Sams saw a big man, florid, somewhat inclined toward corpulence, with the surface geniality and the shrewd, calculating eyes of the successful politician. The senator saw a tall, hard-trained man in his 40s, a lean, keen, smooth-shaven face, a shock of red bronze auburn hair a couple of weeks overdue for a cutting, a pair of gold-flecked, tawny eyes too penetrant for comfort. "I trust, Senator, that Fairchild has taken care of you satisfactorily?" "With 1 or 2 exceptions, yes." Since Sams did not ask what the exceptions could be, Morgan was forced to continue. "I am here, as you know, in my official capacity as chairman of the Pernicious Activities Committee of the North American Senate. It has been observed for years that the published reports of your organization have left much unsaid. It is common knowledge that high-handed outrages have been perpetrated, if not by your men themselves, in such circumstances that your agents could not have been ignorant of them. Therefore, it has been decided to make a first-hand and comprehensive investigation, in which matter your Mr. Fairchild has not been at all cooperative." "Who decided to make this investigation?" "Why, the North American Senate, of course, through its pernicious activities—" "I thought so," Sams interrupted. "Don't you know, Senator, that the Hill is not a part of the North American continent? That the Triplanetary Service is responsible only to the Triplanetary Council?" "Quibbling, sir, and outmoded. This, sir, is a democracy." The senator began to orate. "All that will be changed very shortly, and if you are as smart as you are believed to be, I need only say that you and those of your staff who cooperate—" "You need say nothing at all." Sam's voice cut. "It has not been changed yet. The government of North America rules its continent, as do the other continental governments. The combined continental governments of the 3 planets form the Triplanetary Council, which is a non-political body, the members of which hold office for life, and which is the supreme authority in any matter, small or large, affecting more than one continental government. The Council has 2 principal operating agencies: the Triplanetary Patrol, which enforces its decisions, rules, and regulations, and the Triplanetary Service, which performs such other tasks as the Council directs. We have no interest in the purely internal affairs of North America. Have you any information to the contrary?" "More quibbling!" the senator thundered. "This is not the first time in history that a ruthless dictatorship has operated in the disguise of a democracy. Sir, I demand full access to your files, so that I can spread before the American Senate the full facts of the various matters which I mentioned to Fairchild, one of which was the affair of the Polarian. In a democracy, sir, facts should not be hidden. The people must and shall be kept completely informed upon any matter which affects their welfare or their political lives." "Is that so? If I should ask, then, for the purpose of keeping the Triplanetary Council, and through it your constituents, fully informed as to the political situation in North America, you would undoubtedly give me the key to the safe deposit box in 469T414? For it is common knowledge, in the Council at least, that there is a certain amount of, shall we say, turbidity in the supposedly pellucid reaches of North American politics." "What? Preposterous!" Morgan made a heroic effort, but could not quite maintain his poise. "Private papers only, sir." "Perhaps. Certain of the councilors believe, however mistakenly, that there are several things of interest there, such as the record of certain transactions involving one James F. Towne, references to and details concerning dealings, not to say deals, with Mackenzie Power, specifically with Mackenzie Power's Mr. Clander, and perhaps a juicy bit or two concerning a person known as LeBay and a Teckle coat. Of interest no end, don't you think, to the dear people of North America?" As Samms drove the harpoon in and twisted it, the big man suffered visibly. Nevertheless, "You refuse to cooperate, eh?" he blustered. "Very well, I will go, and you have not heard the last of me, Samms." "No, probably not. But remember, before you do any more rabble-rousing, that this lockbox thing is merely a sample. We of the service know a lot of things that we do not mention to anybody, except in self-defense." "I am holding Mr. Fletcher, Mr. Samms. Shall I put him on now?" Norma asked as the completely deflated Morgan went out. "Yes, please. Hello, Sid. Mighty glad to see you. We were scared for a while. How did you make out, and what was it?" "Hi, Chief. Mostly Hedive. Some heroin and quite a bit of Martian Ladolian. Lousy job, though. 3 of the gang got away and took about a quarter of the loot with them. That was what I wanted to talk to you about in such a hurry. Fake meteors. The first I ever saw." Samms straightened up in his chair. "Just a second. Norma, put Redmond on here with us. Listen, Harry. Now, Fletcher, did you see that fake meteor yourself? Touch it?" "Both. In fact, I've still got it. One of the runners, pretending to be a serviceman, flashed it on me. It's really good, too, Chief. Even now, I can't tell it from my own, except that mine is in my pocket. Shall I send it in?" "By all means. To Dr. H.D. Redmond, head of research. Keep on slugging, Sid. Goodbye." "Now, Harry, what do you think? It could be one of our own, you know." "Could be, but probably isn't. We'll know as soon as we get it in the lab. Chances are, though, that they have caught up with us again. After all, that was to be expected. Anything that science can synthesize, science can analyze, and whatever the morals and ethics of the pirates may be, they have got brains." "And you haven't been able to devise anything better?" "Variations only, which wouldn't take much time to solve. Fundamentally, the present meteor is the best we know. Got anybody you would like to put on it immediately?" "Of course. One of the new boys will be perfect for the job, I think. Name of Bergenholm. Quite a character. Brilliant, erratic, flashes of sheer genius that he can't explain, even to us. I'll put him on it right away." "Thanks a lot. And now, Norma, please keep everybody off my neck that you can. I want to think." And think he did. Keen eyes clouded, staring unseeingly at the papers littering his desk. Triplanetary needed a symbol. A something which would identify a serviceman anywhere, at any time, under any circumstances, without doubt or question. Something that could not be counterfeited or imitated, to say nothing of being duplicated. Something that no scientist not of Triplanetary service could possibly imitate. Better yet, something that no one not of Triplanetary could even wear. Samms grinned fleetingly at that thought. A tall order, calling for a deus ex machina with a vengeance. But, damn it, there ought to be some way to... "Excuse me, sir." His secretary's voice, usually so calm and cool, trembled as she broke in on his thinking. "Commissioner Kinnison is calling. Something terrible is going on again, out towards Orion. Here he is." And there appeared upon Sam's screen the face of the Commissioner of Public Safety, the Commander-in-Chief of Triplanetary's every armed force, whether of land or of water, of air or of empty space. "They've come back, Virgil," the Commissioner rapped out without preliminary or greeting. "4 vessels gone, a freighter and a passenger liner, with their escort of 2 heavy cruisers. All in Sector M, DX about 151. I have ordered all traffic out of space for the duration of the emergency, and since even our warships seem useless, every ship is making for the nearest dock at maximum. How about that new flyer of yours? Got anything that will do us any good?" No one beyond the hill's shielding screens knew that the Boise had already been launched. "I don't know. We don't even know whether we have a super ship or not." And Samms described briefly the beginning, and very probably the ending, of the trial flight, concluding, "It looks bad, but if there was any possible way of handling her, Rodebush and Cleveland did it. All our traces are negative yet, so nothing definite has..." He broke off as a frantic call came in from the Pittsburgh station for the Commissioner, a call which Samms both heard and saw. "The city is being attacked," came the urgent message. "We need all the reinforcements you can send us." And a picture of the beleaguered city appeared in ghastly detail upon the screens of the observers, a view being recorded from the air. It required only seconds for the Commissioner to order every available man and engine of war to the seat of conflict. Then, having done everything they could do, Kinnison and Samms stared in helpless, fascinated horror into their plates, watching the scenes of carnage and destruction depicted there. The Nevian vessel, the sister ship, the craft which Costigan had seen in mid-space as it hurtled earthward in response to Nerado's summons, hung poised in full visibility high above the metropolis. Scornful of the pitiful weapons wielded by man, she hung there, her sinister beauty of line sharply defined against the cloudless sky. From her shining hull there reached down a tenuous but rigid rod of crimson energy, a rod which slowly swept hither and thither as the Nevians searched out the richest deposits of the precious metal for which they had come so far. Iron, once solid, now a viscous red liquid, was sluggishly flowing in an ever-thickening stream up that intangible crimson duct and into the capacious storage tanks of the Nevian raider. And wherever that flaming beam went, there went also ruin, destruction, and death. Office buildings, skyscrapers towering majestically in their architectural symmetry and beauty, collapsed into heaps of debris as their steel skeletons were abstracted. Deep into the ground the beam bored, flood, fire, and explosion following in its wake as the mazes of underground piping disappeared. And the humanity of the buildings died, instantaneously and painlessly, never knowing what struck them, as the life-bearing iron of their bodies went to swell the Nevian stream. Pittsburgh's defenses had been feeble indeed. A few antiquated railway rifles had hurled their shells upward in futile defiance, and had been quietly absorbed. The district planes of Triplanetary, newly armed with iron-driven ultrabeams, had assembled hurriedly and had attacked the invader in formation, with but little more success. Under the impact of their beams, the strangers' screens had flared white. Then poised ship and flying squadron had alike been lost to view in a murkily opaque shroud of crimson flame. The cloud had soon dissolved, and from the place where the planes had been, there floated or crashed down a litter of non-ferrous wreckage. And now the cone of spaceships from the Buffalo base of Triplanetary was approaching Pittsburgh, hurling itself toward the Nevian plunderer, and toward known, gruesome, and hopeless defeat. "Stop them, Rod!" Samms cried. "It's sheer slaughter. They haven't got a thing. They aren't even equipped yet with the iron drive." "I know it," the commissioner groaned. "And Admiral Barnes knows it as well as we do, but it can't be helped. Wait a minute. The Washington cone is reporting. They're as close as the other, and they have the new armament. Philadelphia is close behind, and so is New York. Now perhaps we can do something." The Buffalo flotilla slowed and stopped, and in a matter of minutes the detachments from the other bases arrived. The cone was formed, and iron-driven vessels in the van, the old-type craft far in the rear. It bore down upon the Nevian, vomiting from its hollow front a solid cylinder of annihilation. Once more the screens of the Nevian flared into brilliance. Once more the red cloud of destruction was flung abroad. But these vessels were not entirely defenseless. Their iron-driven ultra-generators threw out screens of the Nevians' own formula, screens of prodigious power to which the energies of the amphibians clung, and at which they clawed and tore in baffled, wildly coruscant displays of power unthinkable. For minutes the furious conflict raged, while the inconceivable energy being dissipated by those straining screens hurled itself in terribly destructive bolts of lightning upon the city far beneath. No battle of such incredible violence could long endure. Triplanetary ships were already exerting their utmost power, while the Nevians, contemptuous of Solarian science, had not yet uncovered their full strength. Thus the last desperate effort of mankind was proved futile as the invaders forced their beams deeper and deeper into the overloaded defensive screens of the war vessels, and one by one the supposedly invincible spaceships of humanity dropped in horribly dismembered ruin upon the ruins of what had once been Pittsburgh. End of Chapter 14. Triplanetary, first in the Lensman series by E. Doc Smith. Chapter 15, Specimens. Only too well-founded was Costigan's conviction that the submarine of the deep-sea fishes had not been able to prevail against Nerado's formidable engines of destruction. For days the Nevian lifeboat, with its 3 terrestrial passengers, hurtled through the interstellar void without incident. But finally the operative's fears were realized. His far-flung detector screens reacted. Upon his observation plate they could see Nerado's mammoth spaceship in full pursuit of its fleeing lifeboat. "On your toes, folks. It won't be long now," Costigan called, and Bradley and Clio hurried into the tiny control room. Armor donned and tested, the 3 terrestrials stared into the observation plates, watching the rapidly enlarging picture of the Nevian spaceship. Nerado had traced them and was following them, and such was the power of the great vessel that the now inconceivable velocity of the lifeboat was the veriest crawl in comparison to that of the pursuing cruiser. "And we've hardly started to cover the distance back to Tellus. Of course you couldn't get in touch with anybody yet?" Bradley stated rather than asked. "I kept trying, of course, until they blanketed my wave, but all negative. Thousands of times too far for my transmitter. Our only hope of reaching anybody was the mighty slim chance that our supership might be prowling around out here already, but it isn't, of course. Here they are." Reaching out to the control panel, Costigan viciously shot out against the great vessel wave after wave of lethal vibrations, under whose fiercely clinging impacts the Nevians' defensive screens flared white. But strangely enough, their own screens did not radiate. As if contemptuous of any weapons the lifeboat might wield, the mothership simply defended herself from the attacking beams in much the same fashion as a wildcat mother wards off the claws and teeth of her spitting, snarling kitten who is resenting a touch of needed maternal discipline. "They probably wouldn't fight us at that." Cleo first understood the situation. "This is their own lifeboat, and they want us alive, you know." "There's one more thing we can try. Hang on," Costigan snapped, as he released his screens and threw all his power into one enormous pressor beam. The three were thrown to the floor and held there by an awful weight, as the lifeboat darted away at the stupendous acceleration of the beam's reaction against the unimaginable mass of the Nevian sky rover. But the flight was of short duration. Along that pressor beam there crept a dull red rod of energy, which surrounded the fugitive shell and brought it slowly to a halt. Furiously then, Costigan set and reset his controls, launching his every driving force and his every weapon. But no beam could penetrate that red murk, and the lifeboat remained motionless in space. No, not motionless. The red rod was shortening, drawing the truant craft back toward the launching port from which she had so hopefully emerged a few days before. Back and back it was drawn, Costigan's utmost efforts futile to effect by a hair's breadth its line of motion. Through the open port the boat slipped neatly, and as it came to a halt in its original position within the multi-layered skin of the monster, the prisoners heard the heavy doors clang shut behind them, one after another. And then sheets of blue fire snapped and crackled about the three suits of triplanetary armor. The two large human figures and the small ones were outlined starkly in blinding blue flame. "That's the first thing that has come off according to schedule," Costigan laughed, a short, fierce bark. "That is their paralyzing ray. We've got it stopped cold, and we've each of us got enough iron to hold it forever." "But it looks as though the best we can do is a stalemate," Bradley argued. "Even if they can't paralyze us, we can't hurt them, and we are headed back for Nevia. I think Narado will come in for a conference, and we'll be able to make terms of some kind. He must know what these Lewistons will do, and he knows that we'll get a chance to use them some way or other before he gets to us again," Costigan asserted confidently. But again he was wrong. The door opened, and through it there waddled, rolled, or crawled a metal-clad monstrosity, a thing with wheels, legs, and writhing tentacles of jointed bronze, a thing possessed of defensive screens sufficiently powerful to absorb the full blast of the triplanetary projectors without effort. Three brazen tentacles reached out through the ravening beams of the Lewistons, smashed them to bits, and wrapped themselves in unbreakable shackles about the armored forms of the three human beings. Through the door the machine or creature carried its helpless load, and out into and along a main corridor, and soon the three terrestrials, without arms, without armor, and almost without clothing, were standing in the control room, again facing the calm and unmoved Narado. To the surprise of the impetuous Costigan, the Nevian commander was entirely without rancor. "The desire for freedom is perhaps common to all forms of animate life," he commented through the transformer. "As I told you before, however, you are specimens to be studied by the College of Science, and you will be so studied in spite of anything you may do. Resign yourselves to that." "Well, say that we don't try to make any more trouble, that we cooperate in the examination and give you whatever information we can," Costigan suggested. "Then you will probably be willing to give us a ship and let us go back to our own world." "You will not be allowed to cause any more trouble," the amphibian declared coldly. "Your cooperation will not be required. We will take from you whatever knowledge and information we wish. In all probability you will never be allowed to return to your own system, because as specimens you are too unique to lose. But enough of this idle chatter. Take them back to their quarters." Back to their three intercommunicating rooms the prisoners were led under heavy guard, and, true to his word, Narado made certain that they had no more opportunities to escape. To Nevia the spaceship sped without incident, and in manacles the terrestrials were taken to the College of Science, there to undergo the physical and psychical examinations which Narado had promised them. Nor had the Nevian scientist captain erred in stating that their cooperation was neither needed nor desired. Furious but impotent, the human beings were studied in laboratory after laboratory by the coldly analytical, unfeeling scientists of Nevia, to whom they were nothing more or less than specimens. And in full measure they came to know what it meant to play the part of an unknown, lowly organism in a biological research. They were photographed externally and internally. Every bone, muscle, organ, vessel, and nerve were studied and charted. Every reflex and reaction was noted and discussed. Meters registered every impulse, and recorders filmed every thought, every idea, and every sensation. Endlessly, day after day, the nerve-racking torture went on until the frantic subjects could bear no more. White-faced and shaking, Clio finally screamed wildly, hysterically, as she was being strapped down upon a laboratory bench, and at the sound Costigan's nerves, already at the breaking point, gave way in an outburst of berserk fury. The man's struggles and the girl's shrieks were alike futile, but the surprised Nevians, after a consultation, decided to give the specimens a vacation. To that end they were installed, together with their earthly belongings, in a 3-roomed structure of transparent metal, floating in the large central lagoon of the city. There they were left undisturbed for a time, undisturbed, that is, except by the continuous gaze of the crowd of hundreds of amphibians which constantly surrounded the floating cottage. "First we're bugs under a microscope," Bradley growled. "Then we're goldfish in a bowl. I don't know that—" He broke off as 2 of their jailers entered the room. Without a word into the transformers, they seized Bradley and Clio. As those tentacular arms stretched out toward the girl, Costigan leaped. A vain attempt. In midair, the paralyzing beam of the Nevians touched him, and he crashed heavily to the crystal floor. And from that floor he looked on in helpless, raging fury, while his sweetheart and his captain were carried out of their prison and into a waiting submarine. End of Chapter 15. Triplanetary, first in the Lensman series by E. Doc Smith. Chapter 16, Supership in Action. Dr. Frederick Rodebush sat at the control panel of Triplanetary's newly reconstructed supership, one finger poised over a small black button. Facing the unknown though the physicist was, yet he grinned whimsically at his friend. Something, whatever it is about to occur. The Boise is about to take off. Ready, Cleve? Shoot, laconically. Cleveland also was constitutionally unable to voice his deeper sentiments in times of stress. Rodebush drove his finger down, and instantly over both men there came a sensation akin to a tremendously intensified vertigo, but a vertigo as far beyond the space sickness of weightlessness as that horrible sensation is beyond mere earthly dizziness. The pilot reached weakly toward the board, but his leaden hands refused utterly to obey the dictates of his reeling mind. His brain was a writhing, convulsive mass of torment indescribable, expanding, exploding, swelling out with an unendurable pressure against its confining skull. Fiery spirals, laced with streaming, darting lances of black and green, flamed inside his bursting eyeballs. The universe spun and whirled in mad gyrations about him as he reeled drunkenly to his feet, staggering and sprawling. He fell. He realized that he was falling, yet he could not fall. Thrashing wildly, grotesquely in agony, he struggled madly and blindly across the room, directly toward the thick steel wall. The tip of one hair of his unruly thatch touched the wall, and the slim length of that single hair did not even bend as its slight strength brought to an instant halt the 180-odd pounds of mass now entirely without inertia, that was his body. But finally the sheer brain power of the man began to triumph over his physical torture. By force of will, he compelled his grasping hands to seize a lifeline, almost meaningless to his dazed intelligence, and through that nightmare incarnate of hellish torture, he fought his way back to the control board. Hooking one leg around a standard, he made a seemingly enormous effort and depressed a red button, then fell flat upon the floor, weakly but in a wave of relief and thankfulness, as his racked body felt again the wonted phenomena of weight and of inertia. White, trembling, frankly and openly sick, the 2 men stared at each other in half-amazed joy. It worked. Cleveland smiled wanly as he recovered sufficiently to speak, then leaped to his feet, Snap it up, Fred. We must be falling fast. We'll be wrecked when we hit. We're not falling anywhere. Rodebush, foreboding in his eyes, walked over to the main observation plate and scanned the heavens. However, it's not as bad as I was afraid it might be. I can still recognize a few of the constellations, even though they are all pretty badly distorted. That means that we can't be more than a couple of light years or so away from the solar system. Of course, since we had so little thrust on, practically all of our energy and time was taken up in getting out of the atmosphere. Even at that, though, it's a good thing that space isn't a perfect vacuum, or we would have been clear out of the universe by this time. Huh? What are you talking about? Impossible. Where are we, anyway? Then we must be making Oh, I see, Cleveland exclaimed, somewhat incoherently, as he also stared into the plate. Right, we aren't traveling at all, now, Rodebush replied. We are perfectly stationary relative to Tellus, since we made that hop without inertia. We must have attained 100% neutralization, 100.00000, which we didn't quite expect. Therefore, we must have stopped instantaneously when our inertia was restored. Incidentally, that original pre-inertialess velocity, intrinsic velocity, suppose we could call it, is going to introduce plenty of complications. But we don't have to worry about them right now. Also, it isn't where we are that is worrying me. We can get fixes on enough recognizable stars to find that out in short order. It's when. That's right, too. Say we're 2 light years away from home. You think maybe that we're 2 years older now than we were 10 minutes ago? Interesting no end, and distinctly possible. Maybe even probable. I wouldn't know. There's been a lot of discussion on that theory, and as far as I know, we're the first ones who ever had a chance to prove or disprove it absolutely. Let's snap back to Tellus and find out right now. We'll do that after a little more experimenting. You see, I had no intention of giving us such a long push. I was going to throw the switches in and out, but you know what happened. However, there's one good thing about it. It's worth 2 years of anybody's life to settle that relativity time thing definitely one way or the other. I'll say it is. But say, we've got a lot of power on our ultrawave, enough to reach Tellus, I think. Let's locate the sun and get in touch with Sam's. Let's work on these controls a little first, so we'll have something to report. Out here's a fine place to try the ship out, nothing in the way. All right with me, but I would like to find out whether I'm 2 years older than I think I am or not. Then, for 4 hours, they put the great supership through her paces, just as test pilots check up on every detail of performance of an airplane of new or radical design. They found that the horrible vertigo could be endured, perhaps in time even conquered, as space sickness could be conquered, by a strong will in a sound body, and that their new conveyance had possibilities of which even Rodebush had never dreamed. Finally, their most pressing questions answered, they turned their most powerful ultrabeam communicator toward the yellowish star which they knew to be Old Sol. Sam's. Cleveland spoke slowly and distinctly. Rodebush and Cleveland reporting from the space-eating Wampus, now directly in line with Beta Ursa Minoris from the sun, distance about 2.2 light years. It will take 6 spans of tubes on your tightest beam, LSV-3, to reach us. Barring a touch of an unusually severe type of space sickness, everything worked beautifully, even better than either of us dared to believe. There's something we want to know right away. Have we been gone 4 hours and some odd minutes, or better than 2 years? He turned to Rodebush and went on, Nobody knows how fast this ultrawave travels, but if it goes as fast as we did coming out, it's no creeper. I'll give him about 30 minutes, then shoot in another. But, interrupting Cleveland's remark, the care-ravaged face of Virgil Samms appeared sharp and clear upon the plate, and his voice snapped curtly from the speaker. Thank God you're alive and twice that the ship works, he exclaimed. You've been gone 4 hours, 11 minutes, and 41 seconds. But never mind about abstract theorizing. Get back here to Pittsburgh as fast as you can drive. That Nevian vessel, or another one like her, is mopping up the city, and has destroyed half the fleet already. We'll be back there in 9 minutes, Rodebush snapped into the transmitter. 2 to get from here to atmosphere, 4 from atmosphere down to the hill, and 3 to cool off. Notify the full 4-shift crew. Everybody we've picked out. Don't need anybody else. Ship, equipment, and armament are ready. 2 minutes to atmosphere? Think you can do it? Cleveland asked as Rodebush flipped off the power and leaped to the control panel. You might though at that. We could do it in less than that if we had to. We use scarcely any power at all coming out, and I'm going to use quite a lot going back, the physicist explained rapidly as he set the dials which would determine their flashing course. The master switches were thrown, and the pangs of inertialessness again assailed them, but weaker far this time than ever before. and upon their lookout plates they beheld a spectacle never before seen by eye of man. For the ultra-beam, with its heterodyned vision, is not distorted by any velocity yet attained, as are the ether-borne rays of light. Converted into light only at the plate, it showed their progress as truly as though they had been traveling at a pace to be expressed in the ordinary terms of miles per hour. The yellow star that was the sun detached itself from the firmament and leaped toward them, swelling visibly, momently, into a blinding monster of incandescence. And toward them also flung the earth, enlarging with such indescribable rapidity that Cleveland protested involuntarily, in spite of his knowledge of the peculiar mechanics of the vessel in which they were. "Hold it, Fred! Hold it! Way enough!" he exclaimed. "I'm using only a few thousand kilograms of thrust, and I'll cut that as soon as we touch atmosphere, long before she can even begin to heat," Rodebush explained. "Looks bad, but we'll stop without a jar." "What would you call this kind of flight, Fritz?" Cleveland asked. "What's the opposite of inert?" "Damned if I know. Isn't any, I guess. Light? No. How would free be?" "Not bad. Free and inert maneuvering, eh? Okay." Flying free, then, the supership came from her practically infinite velocity to an almost instantaneous halt in the outermost, most tenuous layer of the Earth's atmosphere. Her halt was but momentary. Inertia restored, she dropped at a sharp angle downward. More than dropped. She was forced downward by one full battery of projectors driven by iron-powered generators. Soon they were over the hill, whose violet screens went down at a word. Flaming a dazzling white from the friction of the atmosphere through which she had torn her way, the Boise slowed abruptly as she neared the ground, plunging toward the surface of the small but deep artificial lake below the hill's steel apron. Into the cold waters the spaceship dove, and even before they could close over her, furious geysers of steam and boiling water erupted as the stubborn alloy gave up its heat to the cooling liquid. Endlessly the 3 necessary minutes dragged their slow way into time, but finally the water ceased boiling, and Rodebush tore the ship from the lake and hurled her into the gaping doorway of her dock. The massive doors of the airlocks opened, and while the full crew of picked men hurried aboard with their personal equipment, Samms talked earnestly to the 2 scientists in the control room. "And about half the fleet is still in the air. They aren't attacking, they're just trying to keep her from doing much more damage until you can get there. How about your takeoff? We can't launch you again, the tracks are gone, but you handled her easily enough coming in." "That was my fault," Rodebush admitted. "I had no idea that the fields would extend beyond the hull. We'll take her out on the projectors this time, though, the same as we brought her in. She handles like a bicycle. The projector blast tears things up a little, but nothing serious. Have you got that Pittsburgh beam for me yet? We're about ready to go." "Here it is, Dr. Rodebush," came Norma's voice, and upon the screen there flashed into being the view of the events transpiring above that doomed city. "The dock is empty and sealed against your blast." "Goodbye and power to your tubes," came Sam's ringing voice. As the words were being spoken, mighty blasts of power raved from the driving projectors, and the immense mass of the supership shot out through the portals and upward into the stratosphere. Through the tenuous atmosphere the huge globe rushed with ever-mounting speed, and while the hope of Triplanetary drove eastward, Rodebush studied the ever-changing scene of battle upon his plate, and issued detailed instructions to the highly trained specialist manning every offensive and defensive weapon. But the Nevians did not wait to join battle until the newcomers arrived. Their detectors were sensitive, operative over untold thousands of miles, and the ultra-screen of the hill had already been noted by the invaders as the Earth's only possible source of trouble. Thus the departure of the Boise had not gone unnoticed, and the fact that not even with his most penetrant rays could he see into her interior had already given the Nevian commander some slight concern. Therefore, as soon as it was determined that the great globe was being directed toward Pittsburgh, the fish-shaped cruiser of the void went into action. High in the stratosphere, speeding eastward, the immense mass of the Boise slowed abruptly, although no projector had slackened its effort. Cleveland, eyes upon interferometer grating and spectrophotometer charts, fingers flying over calculator keys, grinned as he turned toward Rodebush. "Just as you thought, Skipper, an ultra-band pusher. C4V63L29. Shall I give him a little pull?" "Not yet. Let's feel him out a little before we force a close-up. We've got plenty of mass. See what he does when I put full push on the projectors." As the full power of the Tellurian vessel was applied, the Nevian was forced backward, away from the threatened city, against the full drive of her every projector. Soon, however, the advance was again checked, and both scientists read the reason upon their plates. The enemy had put down reinforcing rods of tremendous power. 3 compression members spread out fanwise behind her, bracing her against the low mountain side, while 1 huge tractor beam was thrust directly downward, holding in an unbreakable grip a cylinder of earth extending deep down into bedrock. 2 can play at that game, and Rodebush drove down similar beams and forward-reaching tractors as well. "Strap yourselves in solid, everybody," he sounded in general warning. "Something is going to give way somewhere soon, and when it does, we'll get a jolt." And the promised jolt did indeed come soon. Prodigiously massive and powerful as the Nevian was, the Boise was even more massive and more powerful, and as the already enormous energy feeding the tractors, pushers, and projectors was raised to its inconceivable maximum, the vessel of the enemy was hurled upward, backward, and that of Earth shot ahead with a bounding leap that threatened to strain even her mighty members. The Nevian anchor rods had not broken. They had simply pulled up the vast cylinders of solid rock that had formed their anchorages. "Grab him now!" Rodebush yelled, and even while an avalanche of falling rock was burying the countryside, Cleveland snapped a tractor ray upon the flying fish and pulled tentatively. Nor did the Nevian now seem averse to coming to grips. The 2 warring super-dreadnoughts darted toward each other, and from the invader there flooded out the dread crimson opacity which had theretofore meant the doom of all things Solarian. Flooded out and engulfed the immense globe of humanity's hope in its spreading cloud of redly impenetrable murk. But not for long. Triplanetary supership boasted no ordinary terrestrial defense, but was sheathed in screen after screen of ultra-vibrations. Imponderable walls, it is true, but barriers impenetrable to any unfriendly wave. To the outer screen the red veil of the Nevians clung tenaciously, licking greedily at every square inch of the shielding sphere of force, but unable to find an opening through which to feed upon the steel of the Boise's armor. "Get back! Way back! Go back and help Pittsburgh!" Rodebush drove an ultra-communicator beam through the murk to the instruments of the terrestrial admiral, for the surviving warships of the fleet, its most powerful units, were hurling themselves forward to plunge into that red destruction. "None of you will last a second in this red field, and watch out for a violet field pretty soon. It'll be worse than this. We can handle them alone, I think. But if we can't, there's nothing in the system that can help us." And now the hitherto passive screen of the supership became active. At first invisible, it began to glow in fierce violet light, and as the glow brightened to unbearable intensity, the entire spherical shield began to increase in size. Driven outward from the supership as a center, its advancing surface of seething energy consumed the crimson murk as a billow of blast furnace heat consumes the cloud of snowflakes in the air above its cupola. Nor was the red death mist all that was consumed. Between that ravening surface and the armor skin of the Boise there was nothing. No debris, no atmosphere, no vapor, no single atom of material substance. The first time in terrestrial experience that an absolute vacuum had ever been attained. Stubbornly contesting every foot of way lost, the Nevian fog retreated before the violet sphere of nothingness. Back and back it fell, disappearing altogether from the space as the violet tide engulfed the enemy vessel. But the flying fish did not disappear. Her triple screens flashed into furiously incandescent splendor, and she entered unscathed that vacuous sphere, which collapsed instantly into an enormously elongated ellipsoid, at each focus a madly warring ship of space. Then in that tube of vacuum was waged a spectacular duel of ultra-weapons. Weapons impotent in air, but deadly in empty space. Beams, rays, and rods of titanic power smote cracklingly against ultra-screens equally capable. Time after time, each contestant ran the gamut of the spectrum with his every available ultra-force, only to find all channels closed. For minutes the terrible struggle went on, then... "Cooper, Adlington, Spencer, Dutton," Rodebush called into his transmitter. "Ready? Can't touch him on the ultra, so I'm going into the macro bands. Give him everything you have as soon as I collapse the violet. Go!" At the word, the violet barrier went down, and with a crash as of a disrupting universe, the atmosphere rushed into the void. And through the hurricane there shot out the deadliest material weapons of Triplanetary. Torpedoes, non-ferrous, ultra-screened, beam dirigible torpedoes charged with the most effective forms of material destruction known to man. Cooper hurled his canisters of penetrating gas, Adlington his allotropic iron atomic bombs, Spencer his indestructible armor-piercing projectiles, and Dutton his shatterable flask of quintessence of corrosion, a sticky, tacky liquid of such dire potency that only one rare Solarian element could contain it. 10, 20, 50, 100 were thrown as fast as the automatic machinery could launch them, and the Nevians found them adversaries not to be despised. Size for size, their screens were quite as capable as those of the Boise. The Nevians' destructive rays glanced harmlessly from their shields, and the Nevians' elaborate screens, neutralized at impact by those of the torpedoes, were impotent to impede their progress. Each projectile must needs be caught and crushed individually by beams of the most prodigious power, and while one was being annihilated, dozens more were rushing to the attack. Then, while the twisting, dodging invader was busiest with the tiny but relentless destroyers, Rodebush launched his heaviest weapon, the macro beams. Prodigious streamers of bluish-green flame which tore savagely through course after course of Nevian screen, malevolent fangs driven with such power and velocity that they were biting into the very walls of the enemy vessel before the amphibians knew that their defensive shells of force had been punctured. And the emergency screens of the invaders were equally futile. Course after course was sent out, only to flare viciously through the spectrum and to go black. Outfought at every turn, the now frantically dodging Nevian leaped away in headlong flight, only to be brought to a staggering, crashing halt as Cleveland nailed her with a tractor beam. But the Tellurians were to learn that the Nevians held in reserve a means of retreat. The tractor snapped, sheared off squarely by a sizzling plane of force, and the fish-shaped cruiser faded from Cleveland's sight, just as the Boise had disappeared from the communicator's plates of Radio Center, back in the hill when she was launched. But though the plates in the control room could not hold the Nevian, she did not vanish beyond the ken of Randolph, now communications officer in the super ship. For, warned and humiliated by his losing one speeding vessel from his plates in Radio Center, he was now ready for any emergency. Therefore, as the Nevian fled, Randolph's spy ray held her, automatically behind it, as there was the full output of 12 special banks of iron-driven power tubes, and thus it was that the vengeful Earthman flashed immediately along the Nevian's line of flight. Inertialess now, pausing briefly from time to time to enable the crew to accustom themselves to the new sensations, Triplanetary's super ship pursued the invader, hurtling through the void with a velocity unthinkable. "He was easier to take than I thought he would be," Cleveland grunted, staring into the plate. "I thought he had more stuff, too," Rodebush assented. "But I guess Costigan got almost everything they had. If so, with all our own stuff and most of theirs besides, we should be able to take them. Conway's data indicated that they have only partial neutralization of inertia. If it's 100%, we'll never catch them, but it isn't. There they are. And this time I'm going to hold her or burn out all our generators trying," Cleveland declared grimly. "Are you fellows down there able to handle yourselves yet? Fine. Start throwing out your cans." Space-hardened veterans all, the other Tellurian officers had fought off the horrible nausea of inertialessness, just as Rodebush and Cleveland had done. Again the ravening green macro beams tore at the flying cruiser. Again the mighty frames of the two spaceships shuddered sickeningly as Cleveland clamped on his tractor rod. Again the highly dirigible torpedoes dashed out with their freights of death and destruction. And again the Nevian sheer plane of force slashed at the Boise's tractor beam, but this time the mighty puller did not give way. Sparkling and spitting high-tension sparks, the plane bit deeply into the stubborn rod of energy. Brighter, thicker, and longer grew the discharges as the gnawing plane drew more and more power. But in direct ratio to that power, the rod grew larger, denser, and ever harder to cut. More and more vivid became the pyrotechnic display, until suddenly the entire tractor rod disappeared. And at the same instant, a blast of intolerable flame erupted from the Boise's flank, and the whole enormous fabric of her shook and quivered under the force of a terrific detonation. "Randolph, I don't see them. Are they attacking or running?" Rodebush demanded. He was the first to realize what had happened. "Running fast. Just as well, perhaps, but get their line. Adlington." "Here." "Good. Was afraid you were gone. That was one of your bombs, wasn't it?" "Yes. Well launched, just inside the screens. Don't see how it could have detonated unless something hot and hard struck it in the tube. It would need about that much time to explode. Good thing it didn't go off any sooner, or none of us would have been here. As it is, Area 6 is pretty well done in, but the bulkheads held the damage to 6. What happened?" "We don't know exactly. Both generators on the tractor beam went out. At first I thought that was all, but my neutralizers are dead and I don't know what else. When the G4s went out, the fusion must have shorted the neutralizers. They would have made a mess. It must have burned a hole down into number 6 tube. Cleveland and I will come down and we'll all look around." Donning spacesuits, the scientists let themselves into the damaged compartment through the emergency airlocks, and what a sight they saw! Both outer and inner walls of alloy armor had been blown away by the awful force of the explosion. Jagged plates hung awry, bent, twisted, and broken. The great torpedo tube, with all its intricate automatic machinery, had been driven violently backwards, and lay piled in hideous confusion against the backing bulkheads. Practically nothing remained whole in the entire compartment. "Nothing much we can do here," Rodebush said finally through his transmitter. "Let's go see what number 4 generator looks like." That room, although not affected by the explosion from without, had been quite as effectively wrecked from within. It was still stiflingly hot. Its air was still reeking with the stench of burning lubricant, insulation, and metal. Its floor was half covered by a semi-molten mass of what had once been vital machinery. For with the burning out of the generator bars, the energy of the disintegrating allotropic iron had had no outlet, and had built up until it had broken through its insulation and in an irresistible flood of power had torn through all obstacles in its path to neutralization. Should have had an automatic shutoff. One detail we overlooked," Rodebush mused. "The electricians can rebuild this stuff here, though that hole in the hull is something else again." "I'll say it's something else," the grizzled chief engineer agreed. "She's lost all her spherical strength. Anchoring a tractor with this ship now would turn her inside out. Back to the nearest triplanetary shop for us, I would say." "Come again, Chief," Cleveland advised the engineer. "None of us would live long enough to get there. We can't travel inertialess unless the repairs are made, so if they can't be made without very much traveling, it's just too bad." "I don't see how we could support our jacks." The engineer paused, then went on. "If you can't give me Mars or Tellus, how about some other planet? I don't care about atmosphere, or about anything but mass. I can stiffen her up in 3 or 4 days if I can sit down on something heavy enough to hold our jacks and presses. But if we have to rig up space cradles around the ship herself, it'll take a long time, months probably. Haven't got a spare planet on hand, have you?" "We might have at that," Rodebush made surprising answer. "A couple of seconds before we engaged, we were heading toward a sun with at least 2 planets. I was just getting ready to dodge them when we cut the neutralizers, so they should be fairly close somewhere. Yes, there's the sun, right over there. Rather pale and small, but it's close, comparatively speaking. We'll go back up into the control room and find out about the planets." The strange sun was found to have 3 large and easily located children, and observation showed that the crippled spaceship could reach the nearest of these in about 5 days. Power was therefore fed to the driving projectors, and each scientist, electrician, and mechanic bent to the task of repairing the ruined generators, rebuilding them to handle any load which the converters could possibly put upon them. For 2 days the Boise drove on, then her acceleration was reversed, and finally a landing was effected upon the forbidding, rocky soil of the strange world. It was larger than the Earth, and of a somewhat stronger gravitation. Although its climate was bitterly cold, even in its short daytime it supported a luxuriant but outlandish vegetation. Its atmosphere, while rich enough in oxygen and not really poisonous, was so rank with indescribably fetid vapors as to be scarcely breathable. But these things bothered the engineers not at all. Paying no attention to temperature or to scenery, and without waiting for a chemical analysis of the air, the space-suited mechanics leaped to their tasks, and in only a little more time than had been mentioned by the chief engineer, the hull and giant frame of the super ship were as staunch as of yore. "All right, Skipper," came finally the welcomed word. "You might try her out with a fast hop around this world before you shove off in earnest." Under the fierce blast of her projectors the vessel leaped ahead, and time after time, as Rodebush hurled her mass upon tractor beam or presser, the engineers sought in vain for any sign of weakness. The strange planet half-girdled, and the severest test passed flawlessly. Rodebush reached for his neutralizer switches. Reached and paused, dumbfounded, for a brilliant purple light had sprung into being upon his panel, and a bell rang out insistently. "What the hell?" Rodebush shot out an exploring beam along the detector line and gasped. He stared, mouth open, then yelled, "Roger is here, rebuilding his planetoid! Stations all!" End of Chapter 16. Triplanetary, first in the Lensman series by E. Doc Smith. Chapter 17, Roger Carries On. As has been intimated, Gray Roger did not perish in the floods of Nevian energy which destroyed his planetoid. While those terrific streamers of force emanating from the crimson obscurity surrounding the amphibian spaceship were driving into his defensive screens, he sat impassive and immobile at his desk, his hard gray eyes moving methodically over his instruments and recorders. When the clinging mantle of force changed from deep red into shorter and shorter wavelengths, however, Baxter, Hartkopf, Chatelier, Anadrunson, Penrose, Nishimura, Mirsky, he called off a list of names. Report to me here at once. The planetoid is lost, he informed his select group of scientists when they had assembled, and we must abandon it in exactly 15 minutes, which will be the time required for the robots to fill this first section with our most necessary machinery and instruments. Pack each of you one box of the things he most wishes to take with him, and report back here in not more than 13 minutes. Say nothing to anyone else. They filed out calmly, and as they passed out into the hall, Baxter, perhaps a trifle less case-hardened than his fellows, at least voiced a thought for those they were so brutally deserting. I say, it seems a bit thick to dash off this way and leave the rest of them, but still, I suppose. You suppose correctly. Bland and heartless, Nishimura filled in the pause. A small part of the planetoid may be able to escape, which to me at least is pleasantly surprising news. It cannot carry all our men and mechanisms, therefore only the most important of both are saved. What would you do? For the rest, it is simply what you call the fortune of war, no? But the beautiful, began the amorous Chatelier. Hush, fool, snorted Hartkopf. One word of that to the ear of Roger, and you too left behind are. Of such non-essentials the universe full is, to be collected in times of ease, but in times hard to be disregarded. And this is a time of Stratelichten indeed. The group broke up, each man going to his own quarters, to meet again in the first section a minute or so before the 0 time. Roger's office was now packed so tightly with machinery and supplies that but little room was left for the scientists. The gray monstrosity still sat unmoved behind his dials. But of what use is it, Roger? The Russian physicist demanded. Those waves are of some ultraband of a frequency immensely higher than anything hitherto known. Our screens should not have stopped them for an instant. It is a mystery that they have held so long, and certainly this single section will not be permitted to leave the planetoid without being destroyed. There are many things you do not know, Mirsky, came the cold and level answer. Our screens, which you think are of your own devising, have several improvements of my own in the formula, and would hold forever had I the power to drive them. The screens of this section, being smaller, can be held as long as will be found necessary. Power? The dumbfounded Russian exclaimed. Why, we have almost infinite power, unlimited, sufficient for a lifetime of high expenditure. But Roger made no reply, for the time of departure was at hand. He pressed down a tiny lever, and a mechanism in the power room threw in the gigantic plunger switches which launched against the Nevians the stupendous beam which so upset the complacence of Narado the amphibian, the beam into which was poured recklessly every resource of power afforded by the planetoid, careless alike of burnout and of exhaustion. Then, while all of the attention of the Nevians, and practically all of their maximum possible power output, was being devoted to the neutralization of that last desperate thrust, the metal wall of the planetoid opened, and the first section shot out into space. Full driven as they were, Roger's screens flared white as he drove through the temporarily lessened attack of the Nevians. But in their preoccupation, the amphibians did not notice the additional disturbance, and the section tore on, unobserved and undetected. Far out in space, Roger raised his eyes from the instrument panel, and continued the conversation as though it had not been interrupted. Everything is relative, Mirsky, and you have misused gravely the term unlimited. Our power was, and is, very definitely limited. True, it then seemed ample for our needs, and is far superior to that possessed by the inhabitants of any solar system with which I am familiar, but the beings behind that red screen, whoever they are, have sources of power as far above ours as ours are above those of the Solarians. How do you know? That power, what is it? We have then the analyses of those fields recorded, came simultaneously questions and exclamations. Their source of power is the intra-atomic energy of iron, complete, not the partial liberation incidental to the nuclear fission of such unstable isotopes as those of thorium, uranium, plutonium, and so on. Therefore much remains to be done before I can proceed with my plan. I must have the most powerful structure in the macrocosmic universe." Roger thought for minutes, nor did any of his minions break the silence. Gharlane of Eddore did not have to wonder why such incredible advancements could have been made without his knowledge. After the fact, he knew. He had been and was still being hampered by a mind of power, a mind with which, in due time, he would come to grips. "I now know what to do," he went on presently. "In the light of what I have learned, the losses of time, life, and treasure, even the loss of the planetoid, are completely insignificant." "But what can you do about it?" growled the Russian. "Many things. From the charts of the recorders, we can compute their fields of force. And from that point, it is only a step to their method of liberating the energy. We shall build robots, they shall build other robots, who shall in turn construct another planetoid, one this time that, wielding the theoretical maximum of power, will be suited to my needs." "And where will you build it? We are marked. Invisibility now is useless. Triplanetary will find us, even if we take up an orbit beyond that of Pluto. We have already left your Solarian system far behind. We are going to another system, one far enough removed so that the spy rays of Triplanetary will never find us, and yet one that we can reach in a reasonable length of time with the energies at our command. Some 5 days will be required for the journey, however, and our quarters are cramped. Therefore make places for yourselves wherever you can, and lessen the tedium of those days by working upon whatever problems are most pressing in your respective researches." The gray monster fell silent, immersed in what thoughts no one knew, and the scientists set out to obey his orders. Baxter, the British chemist, followed Penrose, the lantern-jarred saturnine American engineer and inventor, as he made his way to the furthermost cubicle of the section. "I say, Penrose, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, if you don't mind." "Go ahead. Ordinarily, it's dangerous to be a cackling hen anywhere around him, but I don't imagine that he can hear anything here now. His system must be pretty well shot to pieces. You want to know all I know about Roger?" "Exactly so. You have been with him so much longer than I have, you know. In some ways, he impresses me as being scarcely human, if you know what I mean. Ridiculous, of course, but of late I have been wondering whether he really is human. He knows too much, about too many things. He seems to be acquainted with many solar systems, to visit which would require lifetimes. Then, too, he has dropped remarks which would imply that he actually saw things that happened long before any living man could possibly have been born. Finally, he looks, peculiar, and certainly does not act human. I have been wondering, and have been able to learn nothing about him. As you have said, such talk as this aboard the planetoid was not advisable. You needn't worry about being paid your price, that's one thing. If we live, and that was part of the agreement, you know, we will get what we sold out for. You will become a belted earl. I have already made millions, and shall make many more. Similarly, Chanticleer has had and will have his women, and Dunstrung and Nishimura their cherished revenges, Horkoff his power, and so on." He eyed the other speculatively, then went on, "I might as well spill it all, since I've never had a better chance, and since you should know as much as the rest of us do. You're in the same boat with us, and tarred with the same brush. There's a lot of gossip that may or may not be true, but I know one very startling fact. Here it is. My great-great-grandfather left some notes which, taken in connection with certain things I myself saw on the planetoid, prove beyond question that our Roger went to Harvard University at the same time he did. Roger was a grown man then, and the elder Penrose noted that he was marked like this, and the American sketched a cabalistic design." "What?" Baxter exclaimed. "An adept of North Polar Jupiter then?" "Yes, that was before the first Jovian War, you know. And it was those medicine men, really high-caliber scientists, that prolonged that war so—" "But I say, Penrose, that's really a bit thick. When they were wiped out, it was proved a lot of hocus-pocus." "If they were wiped out," Penrose interrupted in turn. "Some of it may have been hocus-pocus, but most of it certainly was not. I'm not asking you to believe anything except that one fact. I'm just telling you the rest of it. But it is also a fact that those adepts knew things and did things that take a lot of explaining. Now for the gossip, none of which is guaranteed. Roger is supposed to be of Tellurian parentage, and the story is that his father was a moon pirate, his mother a Greek adventuress. When the pirates were chased off the moon, they went to Ganymede, you know, and some of them were captured by the Jovians. It seems that Roger was born at an instant of time sacred to the adepts, so they took him on. He worked his way up through the Forbidden Society, as all adepts did, by various means of murder and job lots of assorted deviltries, until he got clear to the top. The 77th Mystery. The secret of eternal youth, gasped Baxter, awed in spite of himself. Right. And he stayed Chief Devil in spite of all the efforts of all his ambitious sub-devils to kill him, until the turning point of the First Jovian War. He cut away then in a spaceship, and ever since then he has been working, and working hard, on some stupendous plan of his own that nobody else has ever got even an inkling of. That's the story. True or not, it explains a lot of things that no other theory can touch. And now I think you'd better shuffle along. Enough of this is a great plenty. Baxter went to his cubby, and each man of Gray Roger's cold-blooded crew methodically took up his task. True to prediction, in 5 days a planet loomed beneath them, and their vessel settled through a reeking atmosphere toward a rocky and forbidding plain. Then for hours they plunged along, a few thousand feet above the surface of that strange world, while Roger, with his analytical detectors, sought the most favorable location from which to wrest the materials necessary for his program of construction. It was a world of cold. Its sun was distant, pale, and wan. It had monstrous forms of vegetation, of which each branch and member writhed and fought with a grotesque and horrible individual activity. Ever and anon a struggling part broke from its parent plant and darted away in independent existence, leaping upon and consuming or being consumed by a fellow creature equally monstrous. This flora was of a uniform color, a lurid, sickly yellow. In form, some of it was fern-like, some cactus-like, some vaguely tree-like, but it was all outrageous, inherently repulsive to all Solarian senses. And no less hideous were the animal-like forms of life, which slithered and slunk rapaciously through that fantastic pseudo-vegetation. Snake-like, reptile-like, bat-like, the creatures squirmed, crawled, and flew, each covered with a dankly oozing yellow hide, and each motivated by twin common impulses, to kill, and insatiably and indiscriminately to devour. Over this reeking wilderness Roger drove his vessel, untouched by its disgusting, its appalling ferocity and horror. There should be intelligence of a kind, he mused, and swept the surface of the planet with an exploring beam. Ah, yes, there is a city of sorts, and in a few minutes the outlaws were looking down upon a metal-walled city of roundly conical buildings. Inside these structures, and between and around them, there scuttled formless blobs of matter, one of which Roger brought up into his vessel by means of a tractor. Held immovable by the beam, it lay upon the floor, a strangely extensile, amoeba-like, metal-studded mass of leathery substance. Of eyes, ears, limbs, or organs it apparently had none, yet it radiated an intensely hostile aura, a mental effluvium concentrated of rage and of hatred. "Apparently the ruling intelligence of the planet," Roger commented. "Such creatures are useless to us. We can build machines in half the time that would be required for their subjugation and training. Still, it should not be permitted to carry back what it may have learned of us." As he spoke, the adept threw the peculiar being out into the air, and dispassionately rayed it out of existence. "That thing reminds me of a man I used to know back in Penobscot." Penrose was as coldly callous as his unfeeling master. The evenest-tempered man in town. Mad all the time. Eventually, Roger found a location which satisfied his requirements for raw materials, and made a landing upon that unfriendly soil. Sweeping beams denuded a great circle of life, and into that circle leaped robots. Robots requiring neither rest nor food, but only lubricants and power, robots insensible alike to that bitter cold and to that noxious atmosphere. But the outlaws were not to win a foothold upon that inimical planet easily, nor were they to hold it without effort. Through the weird vegetation of the circle's bare edge there scuttled and poured along a horde of the metal-studded men, if men they might be called, who, ferocity incarnate, rushed the robot line. Mowed down by hundreds, still they came on, willing, it seemed, to spend any number of lives in order that one living creature might once touch a robot with one outthrust metallic stud. Whenever that happened, there was a flash of lightning, the heavy smoke of burning insulation, grease, and metal, and the robot went down out of control. Recalling his remaining automatons, Roger sent out a shielding screen against which the defenders of their planet raged in impotent fury. For days they hurled themselves and their every force against that impenetrable barrier, then withdrew, temporarily stopped, but by no means acknowledging defeat. Then, while Roger and his cohorts directed affairs from within their comfortable and now sufficiently roomy vessel, there came into being around it an industrial city of metal, peopled by metallic and insensate mechanisms. Mines were sunk, furnaces were blown in, smelters belched forth into the already unbearable air their sulphurous fumes, rolling mills and machine shops were built and were equipped. And as fast as new enterprises were completed, additional robots were ready to man them. In record time, the heavy work of girders, members, and plates was well under way. And shortly thereafter, light, deft, multi-fingered mechanisms began to build and to install the prodigious amount of precise machinery required by the vastness of the structure. As soon as he was sure that he would be completely free for a sufficient length of time, Roger Garlane assembled, boiled down, and concentrated his every mental force. He probed then very gently for whatever it was that had been and was still blocking him. He found it, synchronized with it, and in the instant hurled against it the fiercest thrust possible for his Eddorian mind to generate, a bolt whose twin had slain more than one member of Eddor's innermost circle, a bolt whose energies, he had previously felt sure, would slay any living thing save only his ultimate supremacy, the all-highest of Eddor. Now, however, and not completely to his surprise, that blast of force was ineffective, and the instantaneous riposte was of such intensity as to require for its parrying everything that Garlane had. He parried it, however barely, and directed a thought at his unknown opponent. "You, whoever you may be, have found out that you cannot kill me. No more can I kill you. So be it. Do you still believe that you can keep me from remembering whatever it was that my ancestor was compelled to forget? Now that you have obtained a focal point, we cannot prevent you from remembering, and merely to hinder you would be pointless. You may remember in peace." Back and back went Garlane's mind, centuries, millennia, cycles, eons. The trace grew dim, almost imperceptible, buried deeply beneath layer upon layer of accretions of knowledge, experience, and sensation which no one of many hundreds of his ancestors had even so much as disturbed. But every iota of knowledge that any of his progenitors had ever had was still his. However dim, however deeply buried, however suppressed and camouflaged by inimical force, he could now find it. He found it. And in the instant of its finding, it was as though in Philistor the Arisian spoke directly to him, as though the fused elders of Arisia tried, vainly now, to erase from his own mind all knowledge of Arisia's existence. The fact that such a race as the Arisians had existed so long ago was bad enough. That the Arisians had been aware throughout all these ages of the Eddorians, and had been able to keep their own existence secret, was worse. The crowning fact that the Arisians had had all this time in which to work unopposed against his own race made even Garlane's indomitable ego quail. This was important. Such minor matters as the wiping out of the non-conforming cultures, the extraordinarily rapid growth of which was now explained, must wait. Eddor must revise its thinking completely. The pooled and integrated mind of the innermost circle must scrutinize every fact, every implication and connotation of this new old knowledge. Should he flash back to Eddor, or should he wait and take the planetoid with its highly varied and extremely valuable contents? He could wait. A few moments more would be a completely negligible addition to the eons of time which had already elapsed since action should have been begun. The rebuilding of the planetoid, then, went on. Roger had no reason to suspect that there was anything physically dangerous within hundreds of millions of miles. Nevertheless, since he knew that he could no longer depend upon his own mental powers to keep him informed as to all that was going on around him, it was his custom to scan from time to time all nearby space by means of ether-borne detectors. Thus it came about that one day, as he sent out his beam, his hard gray eyes grew even harder. "Mirsky, Nishimura, Penrose, come here," he ordered, and showed them upon his plate an enormous sphere of steel, its offensive beams flaming viciously. "Is there any doubt whatever in your minds as to the system to which that ship belongs?" "None at all. Solarian," replied the Russian. "To narrow it still further, Triplanetarian. While larger than any I have ever seen before, its construction is unmistakable. They managed to trace us and are testing out their weapons before attacking. Do we attack or do we run away?" "If Triplanetarian, and surely it is, we attack coldly. This one section is armed and powered to defeat Triplanetary's entire navy. We shall take that ship and shall add its slight resources to our own. And it may even be that they have picked up the 3 who escaped me. I have never been balked for long. Yes, we shall take that vessel, and those 3 sooner or later. Except for the fact that their escape from me is a matter which should be corrected, I care nothing whatever about either Bradley or the woman. Costigan, however, is in a different category. Costigan handled me." Diamond-hard eyes glared balefully at the urge of thoughts to a clean and normal mind unthinkable. "To your posts," he ordered. "The machines will continue to function under their automatic controls during the short time it will require to abate this nuisance." "One moment," a strange voice roared from the speakers. "Consider yourselves under arrest by order of the Triplanetary Council. Surrender and you shall receive impartial hearing. Fight us and you shall never come to trial. From what we have learned of Roger, we do not expect him to surrender. But if any of you other men wish to avoid immediate death, leave your vessel at once. We will come back for you later." "Any of you wishing to leave this vessel have my full permission to do so," Roger announced, disdaining any reply to the challenge of the Boise. "Any such, however, will not be allowed inside the planetoid area after the rest of us return from wiping out that patrol. We attack in 1 minute." "Would not one do better by stopping on?" Baxter, in the quarters of the American, was in doubt as to the most profitable course to pursue. "I should leave immediately if I thought that that ship could win, but I do not fancy that it can. Do you?" "That ship? One triplanetary ship against us?" Penrose laughed raucously. "Do as you please. I'd go in a minute if I thought that there was any chance of us losing, but there isn't, so I'm staying. I know which side my bread's buttered on. Those cops are bluffing, that's all. Not bluffing exactly either, because they'll go through with it as long as they last. Foolish, but it's a way they have. They'll die trying every time instead of running away, even when they know they're licked before they start. They don't use good judgment. None of you are leaving? Very well. You each know what to do," came Roger's emotionless voice. The stipulated minute having elapsed, he advanced a lever, and the outlaw cruiser slid quietly into the air. Toward the poised Boise, Roger steered. Within range, he flung out a weapon new learned and supposedly irresistible to any ferrous thing or creature, the red converter field of the Nevians. For Roger's analytical detector had stood him in good stead during those frightful minutes, in the course of which the planetoid had borne the brunt of Nerado's superhuman attack. In such good stead that from the records of those ingenious instruments he and his scientists had been able to reconstruct not only the generators of the attacking forces, but also the screens employed by the amphibians in the neutralization of similar beams. With a vastly inferior armament, the smallest of Roger's vessels had defeated the most powerful battleships of Triplanetary. What had he to fear in such a heavy craft as the one he now was driving, one so superlatively armed and powered? It was just as well for his peace of mind that he had no inkling that the harmless-looking sphere he was so blithely attacking was in reality the much-discussed, half-mythical super-ship upon which the Triplanetary Service had been at work so long, nor that its already unprecedented armament had been reinforced, thanks to that hated Costigan, with Roger's own every worthwhile idea, as well as with every weapon and defense known to that arch-Nevian Nerado. Unknowing and contemptuous, Roger launched his converter field and instantly found himself fighting for his very life. For, from Rodebush at the controls down, the men of the Boise countered with wave after wave and with salvo after salvo of vibratory and material destruction. No thought of mercy for the men of the pirate ship could enter their minds. The outlaws had each been given a chance to surrender, and each had refused it. Refusing, they knew, as the Triplanetarians knew, and as all modern readers know, meant that they were staking their lives upon victory. For with modern armaments, few indeed are the men who live through the defeat in battle of a war vessel of space. Roger launched his field of red opacity, but it did not reach even the Boise screens. All space seemed to explode into violet splendor as Rodebush neutralized it, drove it back with his obliterating zone of force, but even that all-devouring zone could not touch Roger's peculiarly efficient screen. The outlaw vessel stood out unharmed. Ultraviolet, infrared, pure heat, infrasound, solid beams of high tension, high-frequency stuff in whose paths the most stubborn metals would be volatilized instantly, all iron-driven, every deadly and torturing vibration known was hurled against that screen. But it, too, was iron-driven, and it held. Even the awful force of the macro beam was dissipated by it, reflected, hurled away on all sides in coruscating torrents of blinding, dazzling energy. Cooper, Adlington, Spencer, and Dutton hurled against it their bombs and torpedoes, and still it held. But Roger's fiercest blast and heaviest projectiles were equally impotent against the force shields of the supership. The adept, having no liking for a battle upon equal terms, then sought safety in flight, only to be brought to a crashing, stunning halt by a massive tractor beam. "That must be that polycyclic screen that Conway reported on," Cleveland frowned in thought. "I've been doing a lot of work on that, and I think I've calculated an opener for it, Fred. But I'll have to have number 10 projector and the whole output of number 10 power room. Can you let me play with that much juice for a while? All right, Blake, tune her up to 55,000. There, hold it. Now you other fellows, listen. I'm going to try to drill a hole through that screen with a hollow, quasi-solid beam, like a diamond drill cutting out a core. You won't be able to shove anything into the hole from outside the beam, so you'll have to steer your cans out through the central orifice of number 10 projector. That'll be cold, since I'm going to use only the outer ring. I don't know how long I'll be able to hold the hole open, though, so shoot them along as fast as you can. Ready? Here goes." He pressed a series of contacts. Far below, in number 10 converter room, massive switches drove home, and the enormous mass of the vessel quivered under the terrific reaction of the newly calculated semi-material beam of energy that was hurled out, backed by the mightiest of all the mighty converters and generators of Triplanetary's super dreadnought. That beam, a pipe-like hollow cylinder of intolerable energy, flashed out, and there was a rending, tearing crash as it struck Roger's hitherto impenetrable wall. Struck and clung, grinding, boring in, while from the raging inferno that marked the circle of contact of cylinder and shield, the pirate's screen radiated scintillating torrents of crackling, streaming sparks, lightning-like in length and in intensity. Deeper and deeper the gigantic drill was driven. It was through, pierced Roger's polycyclic screen, exposed the bare metal of Roger's walls, and now, concentrated upon one point, flamed out in seemingly redoubled fury Triplanetary's raging beams in vain. For even as they could not penetrate the screen, neither could they penetrate the wall of Cleveland's drill, but rebounded from it in the cascaded brilliance of thwarted lightning. "Oh, what a dumbbell I am!" groaned Cleveland. "Why, oh, why didn't I have somebody rig up a secondary SX7 beam on 10's inner rings? Hop to it, will you, Blake? So that we'll have it in case they are able to stop the cans." But the pirate could not stop all of Triplanetary's projectiles, now hurtling along inside the pipe as fast as they could be driven. In fact, for a few minutes, Gray Roger, knowing that he faced the first real defeat of his long life, paid no attention to them at all, nor to any of his useless offensive weapons. He struggled only to break away from the savage grip of the Boise's tractor rod. Futile. He could neither cut nor stretch that inexorably anchoring beam. Then he devoted his every resource to the closing of that unbelievable breach in his shield. Equally futile. His most desperate efforts resulted only in more frenzied displays of incandescence along the curved surface of contact of that penetrant cylinder. And through that terrific conduit came speeding package after package of destruction. Bombs, armor-piercing shells, gas shells of poisonous and corrosive fluids followed each other in close succession. The surviving scientists of the planetoid, expert gunners and raymen all, destroyed many of the projectiles, but it was not humanly possible to cope with them all, and the breach could not be forced shut against the all but irresistible force of Cleveland's opener. And with all his power, Roger could not shift his vessel's position in the grip of Triplanetary's tractors sufficiently to bring a projector to bear upon the supership along the now unprotected axis of that narrow but deadly tube. Thus it was that the end came soon. A warhead touched steel plating, and there ensued a space-racking explosion of atomic iron. Gaping wide, helpless, with all defenses down, other torpedoes entered the stricken hulk and completed its destruction even before they could be recalled. Atomic bombs literally volatilized most of the pirate vessels. Vials of pure corrosion began to dissolve the solid fragments of her substance into dripping corruption. Reeking gases filled every cranny of circumambient space as what was left of Roger's battlecruiser began the long plunge to the ground. The supership followed the wreckage down, and Rodebush sent out an exploring spy ray. Resistance was such that it was necessary to employ corrosive, and ship and contents were completely disintegrated, he dictated a little later into his vessel's log. While there were of course no remains recognizable as human, it is certain that Roger and his last 11 men died, since it is clear that the circumstances and conditions were such that no life could possibly have survived. It is true that the form of flesh which had been known as Roger was destroyed. The solids and liquids of its substance were resolved into their component molecules and atoms. That which had energized that form of flesh, however, could not be harmed by any physical force, however applied. Therefore, that which made Roger what he was, the essence which was Gharlane of Eddore, was actually back upon his native planet even before Rodebush completed his study of what was left of the pirate's vessel. The innermost circle met, and for a space of time, which would have been very long indeed for any earthly mind, those monstrous beings considered as one multiply intelligence every newly exposed phase and facet of the truth. At the end, they knew the Arisians as well as the Arisians knew them. The All-Highest then called a meeting of all the minds of Eddore. Hence it is clear that these Arisians, while possessing minds of tremendous latent capability, are basically soft and therefore inefficient, he concluded. Not weak, mind you, but scrupulous and unrealistic, and it is by taking advantage of these characteristics that we shall ultimately triumph. A few details, All-Highest, if your ultimate supremacy would deign, a lesser Eddorian requested. Some of us have not been able to perceive at all clearly the optimum lines of action. While detailed plans of campaign have not yet been worked out, there will be several main lines of attack. A purely military undertaking will of course be one, but it will not be the most important. Political action by means of subversive elements and obstructive minorities will prove much more useful. Most productive of all, however, will be the operations of relatively small but highly organized groups whose functions will be to negate, to tear down, and destroy every bulwark of what the weak and spineless adherents of civilization consider the finest things in life: love, truth, honor, loyalty, purity, altruism, decency, and so on. Ah, love. Extremely interesting. Supremacy, this thing they call sex, Gharlane offered. What a silly, what a meaningless thing it is. I have studied it intensely, but am not yet fully enough informed to submit a complete and conclusive report. I do know, however, that we can and will use it. In our hands, vice will become a potent weapon indeed. Vice, drugs, greed, gambling, extortion, blackmail, lust, abduction, assassination. Ah, exactly. There will be room and need for the fullest powers of every Eddorian. Let me caution you all, however, that little or none of this work is to be done by any of us in person. We must work through echelon upon echelon of higher and lower executives and supervisors if we are to control efficiently the activities of the thousands of billions of operators which we must and will have at work. Each echelon of control will be vastly greater in number than the one immediately above it, but correspondingly lower in the individual power of its component personnel. The sphere of activity of each supervisor, however small or great, will be clearly and sharply defined. Rank, from the operators at planetary population levels up to and including the Eddorian Directorate, will be a linear function of ability. Absolute authority will be delegated. Full responsibility will be assumed. Those who succeed will receive advancement and satisfaction of desire. Those who fail will die. Since the personnel of the lower echelons will be of small value and easy replacement, it is of little moment whether or not they become involved in reverses affecting the still lower echelons whose activities they direct. The echelon immediately below us of Eddore, however, and incidentally, it is my thought that the Plurans will best serve as our immediate underlings, must never, under any conditions, allow any hint of any of its real business to become known either to any member of any lower echelon or to any adherent of civilization. This point is vital. Everyone here must realize that only in that way can our own safety remain assured, and we must take pains to see to it that any violator of this rule is put instantly to death. Those of you who are engineers will design ever more powerful mechanisms to use against the Arisians. Psychologists will devise and put into practice new methods and techniques, both to use against the able minds of the Arisians and to control the activities of mentally weaker entities. Each Eddorian, whatever his field or his ability, will be given the task he is best fitted to perform. That is all. And upon Arisia, too, while there was no surprise, a general conference was held. While some of the young watchmen may have been glad that the open conflict for which they had been preparing so long was now about to break, Arisia as a whole was neither glad nor sorry. In the great scheme of things, which was the cosmic all, this whole affair was an infinitesimal incident. It had been foreseen, it had come. Each Arisian would do to the fullest extent of his ability that which the very fact of his being an Arisian would compel him to do. It would pass. In effect, then, our situation has not really changed, Eukonidor stated, rather than asked, after the elders had again spread their visualization for public inspection and discussion. This killing, it seems, must go on. This stumbling, falling, and rising, this blind groping, this futility, this frustration, this welter of crime, disaster, and bloodshed. Why? It seems to me that it would be much better, cleaner, simpler, faster, more efficient, and involving infinitely less bloodshed and suffering, for us to take now a direct and active part, as the Eddorians have done, and will continue to do. Cleaner, youth, yes, and simpler, easier, less bloody. It would not, however, be better, or even good, because no end point would ever be attained. Young civilizations advance only by overcoming obstacles. Each obstacle surmounted, each step of progress made, carries its suffering as well as its reward. We could negate the efforts of any echelon below the Eddorians themselves, it is true. We could so protect and shield each one of our protege races that not a war would be waged and not a law would be broken. But to what end? Further contemplation will show you immature thinkers that in such a case not one of our races would develop into what the presence of the Eddorians has made it necessary for them to become. From this it follows that we would never be able to overcome Eddore. Nor would our conflict with that race remain indefinitely at stalemate. Given sufficient time during which to work against us, they will be able to win. However, if every Arisian follows his line of action as it is laid out in this visualization, all will be well. Are there any more questions? None. The blanks which you may have left can be filled in by a mind of very moderate power. Look here, Fred. Cleveland called attention to the plate, upon which was pictured a horde of the peculiar inhabitants of that ghastly planet, wreaking their frenzied electrical wrath upon everything within the circle bared of native life by Roger's destructive beams. I was just going to suggest that we clean up the planetoid that Roger started to build, but I see that the local boys and girls are attending to it. Just as well, perhaps. I would like to stay and study these people a little while, but we must get back onto the trail of the Nevians. And the Boise leaped away into space toward the line of flight of the amphibians. They reached that line, and along it they traveled at full normal blast. As they traveled, their detecting receivers and amplifiers were reaching out with their utmost power, ultra instruments capable of rendering audible any signal originating within many light years of them, upon any possible communications band. And constantly at least 2 men, with every sense concentrated in their ears, were listening to those instruments. Listening, straining to distinguish in the deafening roar of background noise from the overdriven tubes any sign of voice or of signal. Listening, while millions upon millions of miles beyond even the prodigious reach of those ultra instruments, 3 human beings were even then sending out into empty space an almost hopeless appeal for the help so desperately needed. End of chapter 17.